Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Sadu, and today we're going to be chatting about the dietary approach if it fits your macros, or IIFYM for short, and whether it's the right method for you. So first of all, what is IIFYM, or if it fits your macros? So the term macros is short for macronutrients, and the three macronutrients are protein, carbohydrates, and fat. So some folks include alcohol as the fourth macronutrient, but for the sake of this episode, we're just going to focus on the three major ones. So protein, carbs, and fat. Protein contains 4 calories per gram, carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram as well, and then fat has 9 calories per gram. So let's say someone was shooting for a total of 150 grams of protein, 200 grams of carbohydrates, and 65 grams of fat for the day. That equates to right around 2,000 calories, but when you're following the IIFYM approach, you focus more on total macronutrients more so than calories, but essentially they're the same thing at the end of the day. Now, focusing on total calories would be kind of like looking at how much total money you're spending every day. And then looking at your macro totals is sort of like taking a step further and looking at what you're actually spending that amount of money on. So for our example, we've got 150 grams of protein, 200 grams of carbs, and 65 grams of fat. Now, I just want to clarify really quickly, 150 grams of chicken doesn't equate to 150 grams of protein, because chicken has a bunch of water in it, a little bit of fat in there, and it's made up of about 30% protein, meaning 150 grams of weighed cooked chicken breast has about 45 grams of protein in it. I just wanted to clear that up because I've gotten that question a lot from clients in the past around totaling up protein, carb, and fat digits. So, okay, now let's get back to our example. With this IIFYM approach, you can technically pick and choose whatever food sources you'd like throughout the day that add up to your macro totals. And as long as you hit those targets, it doesn't necessarily matter what food sources you choose, within reason, of course. So there is a fair bit of flexibility with this IIFYM approach. Now, there isn't unlimited flexibility, of course, because there are pros and cons to every dietary method. So for example, if you crushed a whole bunch of peanut butter at breakfast, you might kind of screw yourself because you used up all of your fat macros for the day, and then you'd have to choose essentially fat-free protein and carbohydrate options for the remainder of your intake. So you do need to be mindful of how everything fits together for your day as a whole. Also, like any approach, there are better and worse ways to do them, because someone could fill their intake with solely healthful single ingredient whole foods that they cook themselves and make their totals add up. Or they could just have a whole bunch of protein powder and peanut butter and jam sandwiches and hypothetically hit their protein, carb, and fat totals as well, which is obviously not ideal. Now, this isn't exclusive to the IIFYM approach, because there are better and worse versions of every single dietary approach out there. But just for the example's sake, let's take the keto diet as well. So you could eat nothing but bacon and cheese and still technically be doing the keto diet. Or you could eat a variety of low-carb vegetables, quality animal sources of protein, and maybe even a little bit of low-carb fruit like berries, and that's also considered a ketogenic diet. So there are better and worse ways to do every dietary approach. Now, the primary advantage to IIFYM is the flexibility that it affords you around food choices. But of course, like we mentioned before, everything has benefits and drawbacks. And the drawback around having all that flexibility is that you need to track everything really closely. Because if you're implementing a ton of different foods, that means that there's more room for error, both on a meal-to-meal basis and on a day-to-day basis. So you've got to be really diligent around tracking your intake. Most folks that do IIFYM use something like MyFitnessPal or other apps that are similar to it. So they have a running total of their macros for the day. You also need to weigh and measure all of your food because you have definitive macros to hit, right? So in order to hit your digits accurately, you need to be really accurate with your portions. And on the contrary, for example, someone who isn't including as much variety or flexibility in their day-to-day eating and is emphasizing single ingredient whole foods most likely won't have to track quite as closely because single ingredient whole foods are a lot more filling than processed foods are. Now, why does that matter? If someone is doing IIFYM and eating 5 fast food meals per week and including a small dessert every night, they need to track their whole intake really closely because it's going to be super easy to blow their calorie or macro budget with the 5 fast food meals and a small dessert daily. On the contrary, if someone is having 1 fast food meal and 1 dessert per week and the rest of their intake is single ingredient whole food that they're cooking themselves, they're much less likely to eat as many calories as the IIFYM person because the single ingredient whole foods are a lot more filling, and the whole food person is going to likely spontaneously eat less day to day, and therefore they won't need to track quite as closely in the vast majority of cases. Now, obviously, this affords a little less flexibility in the case of the single ingredient whole foods person that's not tracking quite as closely, but these are just trade-offs at the end of the day. One thing that I've noticed anecdotally about IIFYM is that it usually works the best for larger males that lift weights on a regular basis. Now, why is that? First of all, the approach is just popular with males who lift weights because they're the actual specific subgroup of folks that created the approach to begin with. But outside of that, larger males eat more total calories and therefore have more quote unquote room in their diets to add treat foods and still stay on track. So for example, a 200-pound male that's eating 3,000 calories to maintain their weight can pretty easily afford to set aside, say, 500 calories for a nightly dessert and still eat another 2,500 calories from whole food that will most likely leave them feeling nice and full. But on the other hand, if you take a 120-pound female that's eating 1,500 calories to maintain her weight, so half of what the 200-pound male is, if she ate a 500-calorie dessert, that's 33% of her total intake for the whole day. So now she's only left with 1,000 calories from other food sources to fill her up. Now, in the case of a 120-pound female's case, it's a lot harder to maintain an eating paradigm like this because relatively speaking, it's a much larger percent of her total calories, that 500-calorie dessert is, if she chooses higher calorie options, meaning she's got less wiggle room with her nutritional intake. So that's just one caveat to keep in mind with IIFYM. So if you're someone who doesn't mind weighing and measuring your food and tracking your intake super closely with an app like MyFitnessPal or something like it, and you also like a lot of flexibility with your food choices, you might want to give the IIFYM approach a go. On the other hand, if you're not crazy about tracking your intake super closely, then this method likely isn't for you because it's baked into the cake due to all the flexibility that it affords. Also, it's worth mentioning that some folks actually don't like having too many choices to make or too much flexibility in their diet because decision fatigue is a real thing. So when essentially every food is on the table in a sense or an option for you, some people feel overwhelmed with that. And if you're one of these people, then you might benefit from setting more strict landlines with your nutrition. There's no right or wrong here, just personal preference, and everyone's different. Just know yourself. So the person that likes a little more clear landlines or just not as many options might prefer something like a low carb approach, or you may limit your intake heavily on the processed foods front, or you might have simple rules around food like only having dessert a couple times a week, otherwise you stay on track. Whatever, there are tons of different ways you can piece this together. Also, the whole tracking every little thing with this IIFYM approach can be a bit of a double-edged sword for some folks because being that diligent to a point of where you're pulling out your tracking app every single time you eat does have some folks pay actually too much attention to their food intake and potentially get a little bit obsessive about it. So these are all just things to keep in mind that you want to balance out and decide whether this is the right approach or something else is the right approach for you. There are a ton of different ways to regulate your calorie intake, and IIFYM is just one of them, but I thought it would be helpful to go over the approach with you guys just so you could learn what it is and whether you'd like to give it a go or not. At the end of the day, there's nothing inherently special about this approach. It's just another way to get a grip on your food intake. And it works for some folks, it doesn't work for some others because there's no one size fits all. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you're well aware of that. Now, if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching or workout programming, you can check out the website at n1fitness.com/coaching, which is linked below, to book a consultation with me and see if we're the right fit for one another. You can also follow me on Instagram at n1fitness and friend me up at Marcus Sadu on Facebook as well. I hope you found this episode useful. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you guys next week. See ya.